Hello, everyone. I want to apologize in advance because this is going to be a longer lecture video, but it's going to contain very important information that you will need as you move into Project 3 and Project 4. So I want to remind you about the conversation that we are in. Remember this Kenneth Burke quote? I've shared it every single time. I love it so much. We are in the part of the conversation where you listen for a while until you decide that you've caught the tenor of the argument. We are listening to the conversation. We are not bringing our opinion into the conversation. So, what does listening to the conversation look like in this modern world? It looks like drawing on sources to get information about various stakeholders. And so, Project 3 is going to kind of be dipping your toes into this listening to the conversation. What you're going to do is you're going to research source material for 2 out of the 4 stakeholders that you will explore in the Mapping the Conversations essay. I talked about this in my last lecture video. For Project 3, you're going to need a list of 3 stakeholders, 2 primary and 1 secondary. Remember, a primary source comes from the stakeholder's perspective, while a secondary source is about the stakeholder. And you will include MLA citations. So you should have a total of 6 text, 6 sources and citations, 3 for each stakeholder that you're talking about. Then for each stakeholder, you'll have 1 paragraph that contextualizes and synthesizes their conversation. We're going to talk about how to do this today. And then lastly, you're going to have 1 paragraph where you place this 2 stakeholders in conversation with one another using stasis theory. We are also going to talk about stasis theory today. So our goal for today is to talk about how to synthesize the sources and how to then put the stakeholders in conversation with one another using stasis theory. So remember, I have this spider web illustration of your issue. So again, this is what the stakeholder analysis looks like. You're going to cover 2 of your 4 stakeholders. You're going to find sources for each. You're going to include MLA citations. You're going to have that 1 paragraph per stakeholder, and then the last paragraph. So in total, you should have 6 MLA citations and 3 paragraphs for your stakeholder analysis. So let's talk about stasis theory. Stasis theory is something that the ancient Greeks used to show us basically where people agree and disagree. Or in better words, where do they find common ground and where do they lose common ground? So if you are talking about stasis, you would say they either have stasis or they lose stasis. They have common ground or they lose common ground. So no stasis means no common ground. And there's a very purposeful sequence to stasis theory. The sequence is fact, definition, value or quality, and policy or proposal. And these are the 4 levels, and you have to go through each level. So if they disagree on the level of fact, they cannot move on to the level of definition. But if they agree on the level of fact, then they can move on to definition and then on to value and on to policy and so on and so forth. And so what does this look like? How do you determine the facts, the definitions, the values, or the evaluation, or in the proposals of any given argument? Well, you can ask some of these questions. You're going to look at, okay, what are the facts? What are the established basic facts of the scenario? Do the sources agree on those? Definition, what's the nature of the thing or the problem? How are they defining the issue? Arguments of evaluation is looking at its quality or cause, and perhaps even looks at how it's measured, how is it valued? And then proposal is what action should be taken. We're really familiar with policies in America, right? Because we always hear politicians talking about their policies, right? What do they think should be done about the issue? But we can't get to this level of policy until we've looked at all these other levels. Do we agree or disagree on the other levels? And so here's some questions that we're going to help you as you're determining levels of fact, definition, value, and policy as you read through your sources. I recommend that you take a screenshot of this slide so that you have these questions readily available as you're looking through your sources. So questions of fact, do people agree that this is an issue of concern? Maybe they don't even agree that it's an issue of concern. One example that I like to use of this is climate change, right? Some people think it is a huge issue of concern, while others don't even think it's an issue at all. So there would be a loss of stasis, a loss of common ground on the level of fact with that issue. And then also, what are the facts held by those who hold opinions on this matter? Do they agree on those facts? Do they draw those facts from the same sources? Do they draw those facts from different sources? If they draw their facts from different sources, then they would also lose stasis on the level of fact because they disagree on the basic facts of the matter. And then moving on to the question of definition. Question of definition, do people understand and define the topic in the same way? A classic example, a controversial example of definition is the abortion argument. When do we define when life begins, right? That is going to be the place where we lose stasis in that conversation because we are not defining the topic in the same way. And then question of value or quality. What's the moral character of the topic or position? What does this reveal about values held? Moral character, that's kind of an ambiguous phrase, but basically just means what does this reveal about their values? So for a lighthearted example, littering. Don't mess with Texas, right? We don't litter. However, some people care a lot about littering, while other people just don't care as much, right? It's not that they disagree on the facts or the definition of the issue. They just disagree on how they value the issue. There's not the same level of care or quality that goes into it. And then last but not least, of course, policy. What do we do about it? What is the solution? And so once we've gone through these intentional levels of stasis, we can get a better idea of how stakeholders relate to one another. And so let's talk about using this stasis theory to support our synthesis of our stakeholders. So for your synthesis, you're going to this is going to be the last paragraph. So you're going to spend 2 paragraphs discussing your sources. And I'm gonna draw an illustration here in a second that's going to show you a little bit more what I mean by giving a contextualization and synthesis of the sources for each stakeholder. And then at the end, you're going to use stasis theory to show where do these stakeholders agree and disagree. And so a synthesis is simply a discussion that forges connections between the arguments of 2 or more authors. 2 or more authors. This is coming from your sources. Remember, you should have 3 sources per stakeholder. All right. And so what do these authors have to say about the stakeholder? Remember, 2 of those are going to be primary sources from the stakeholder's perspective, while 1 is going to be a secondary source about the stakeholder's perspective. And so an effective synthesis does 2 things. It introduces the topic or controversy. That's that contextualization that the rubric talks about. And then it lays out multiple perspectives, explaining where they agree and disagree. And so what does this look like? I have a little chart here that can show a little bit more what I'm talking about. So we have a level of context, which is not necessarily a level of stasis, but it is important to outline. And then we have fact, definition, just going to put fact, definition, value, and policy over here. So we kind of have these 4 levels. So from our first source, we might get a really good view of what is the context of the situation. We might also see some of the facts that they're using, but maybe there's just nothing when it comes to the definition. We're going to have to look to a second source to get, okay, how are they defining the topic? But we also get an evaluation. Okay, their values, the way they view the issue, what motivates them. And I'm going to assume that if it's coming from a primary source, it's probably going to be a positive evaluation, just generally speaking. And usually they draw this from the facts that they present within the source. And usually this motivates their policy that they then will present. Maybe the first source does talk about policy. Maybe the second source doesn't mention policy at all. So you see how you're going to have to draw from multiple sources to kind of fill in the blanks of where do the stakeholders land on each of these issues. Well, our third source, I'm sorry, is going to be from a secondary perspective. It's going to be about the stakeholder. So some of the information might be different. In fact, I encourage you to look at a lot of sources, both primary and secondary, to get a really full picture of what's going on with any given stakeholder. And so maybe it provides a context as well, but maybe it provides context that is not included in your primary source. And maybe it uses facts, but maybe the facts disagree with the facts that are in the primary source. And maybe because of that, it has a negative evaluation of the values and then a completely different policy proposal. All of these things still relate to that single stakeholder. And then for your synthesis, I also have my arrows that I've created here. That's going to help create the elements of your stakeholder paragraph. So you're going to be able to tell us who is the stakeholder and what's their relationship to the issue. What context is needed to understand the issue and the stakeholder's values. And then what do the sources reveal about the stakeholder's perspective, motivation, values, and so on. Here are a couple of different frames that you can use to help you get into a conversation when discussing ongoing debates. These are frames that come from a book called They Say, I Say, and I'll put that up here. It's a great book if you struggle with providing frames for issues. But one way you can do it is in discussion of X, whatever your issue is. One controversial issue has been fill in the blank. On the one hand, stakeholder 1 argues blank, and on the other hand, stakeholder 2 contends blank. Others even maintain, and others would be, of course, stakeholders 3 and 4 whenever you get to those. And so you can see how these frames can kind of give you a format in which to place this information. I will say, on the one hand and on the other hand, one of my pet peeves with writing is whenever students use the phrase on the other hand without ever mentioning what's on the first hand. So make sure if you use the phrase on the other hand, you have first said on the one hand. Another frame that you can use, a number of sociologists, or fill in the blank for whoever stakeholder it is, have recently suggested that X's work have blah, 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 blah. Or it has become common today to dismiss X. However, or in their recent work, Y and Z have offered harsh critiques of A and B for whatever. And so these are ways that you can place the stakeholders in conversation with one another. If you want to look at more possible frames, you can look up PDFs of the They Say, I Say, and there are frames there. But just be aware that just because you're using this frame doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct frame for the situation. They have lots of different frames that you can use. Make sure you understand the frame that you're using, that it sets up the scenario correctly. So what does this look like practically? If we use our example that is talked about throughout the textbook, our standardized test score is the best way to judge a student's academic success. This is our research question. Possible stakeholders would be students, parents, teachers, administrators, legislators, lobbyists, testing companies. You only have to pick 4 of these for project 4 and 2 for project 3. All right, so pick 2 of these stakeholders that you want to compare. And then start asking questions of fact, definition, value, and policy. And so questions of fact, do stakeholders agree that this is an issue of concern? Can they agree on the basic facts? So what would this look like? Are standardized tests used to judge academic success, or is standardized testing an issue of concern? And then for every question you want to ask, what do we learn about the stakeholders' values at this level? So you want to ask that question every single time. So for questions of definition, do people understand and define the topic the same way? So some questions could be, how do they define academic success? Or how do they define standardized testing? And then once again, what does this reveal about the stakeholders' values? Questions of value or quality. How much value should be placed on standardized testing? How do we correlate test scores with academic success? Do we measure success in the same way? So these are questions of value or quality. And then again, what do we learn about the stakeholders' value? And last but not least, questions of policy. What do we do about it? So what should we do about standardized testing? How much time and money should we spend on it? Should testing determine student success? These are all examples of questions that you can be asking at the various levels. You do not have to come up with these questions before looking at your sources. Rather, I encourage you to look at your sources and see what answers to these kinds of questions are revealed. So let's look at an example paragraph of how does this look drawn together as a paragraph. So here's a really great example of a paragraph that in a way it kind of does both of what we're looking for. It contextualizes both the stakeholder itself and then also places them in conversation with other stakeholders. You're going to break those up into different paragraphs. You're going to have a paragraph that talks about the synthesis within the stakeholder for both stakeholder 1 and 2, and then you're going to have a third paragraph that talks about how do they have or lose common ground. So in this paragraph, we have perhaps the most well-known voice in this argument is that of AI scientists and inventors. So we have a wonderful topic sentence here that introduces exactly which stakeholder we're talking about. To be frank, the field of AI is rather large with numerous subfields which are all independent of one another. With this in mind, the most common areas of AI are knowledge representation, heuristic searching, planning, expert systems, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are all the different fields that relate to AI. And these are the sources that they're drawing from to come up with, okay, who all is categorized in AI scientists and inventors. This group, so this group that they've just defined and listed, seeks to create new technologies that both benefit society and individuals for the greater good. So this is their goals and their motivation. This idea of value-driven progress is where other groups would most likely agree. So other groups being other stakeholders would most likely agree with scientists and inventors. Those other groups, such as professionals and consumers, all right, so we have a definition who are our other stakeholders, would want AI that are a benefit to their respective fields. AI would improve productivity while also limiting total manpower. However, the greater good may act as a mask for some scientists to acquire wealth and fame strictly for selfish reasons. Okay, so they're acknowledging there's possibly an other motivation, a different value at play here. Scientists and inventors tend to argue that the fundamental goal of AI research is not merely to mimic intelligence or produce some clever fake. AI wants only the genuine article, machines with minds in the full and literal sense. And so here we have a beautifully integrated quote. And of course, we have our sources as well. Of course, this is where AI scientists and inventors become divided. Okay, so there can be a loss of stasis even within this stakeholder group. Some scientists believe that AI cannot think in the same literal sense as human beings, while others argues that thinking is comparable to a machine's computing. To make matters worse, this can also be seen as the point where this group becomes estranged from consumers and the public as a whole. Okay, so here we're seeing a loss of common ground with other stakeholders. Scientists will argue using facts and logic, while the public oftentimes has different viewpoints concerning value and policy. So there's a lot going on in this paragraph, but you can see how they're using the language of stasis to show where they agree and disagree, where they are divided, where they are estranged from one another. And so you can see in this map up, we have our topic sentence. Then we have kind of where this stasis is within the stakeholder group and who that stakeholder group is, and then how they either disagree within the stakeholder group and how they lose stasis with other stakeholders. And so what you're going to do for your project 3 is you're going to kind of break this up. This will be your stakeholder paragraph, and then this is going to be your stasis or synthesis paragraph. All right. So I'm going to provide an illustration here that's going to show you a little bit more how you draw all these together from your different sources. So you have your different sources that you're drawing from to gain information about your stakeholders, but then you have your individual stakeholders. We're not going to worry about 3 and 4 right now. That is going to be a part of project 4. We're just going to look at stakeholders 1 and 2. So you're going to have your fact, definition, value, and policy for each stakeholder. You're going to look and see, okay, we have the facts for stakeholder 1 and stakeholder 2. Say we're looking at students and teachers. Maybe they both agree on the facts of the situation here. So let's move on to definition. Are they defining the terms the same way? Maybe they do. And maybe it's only whenever we get to the level of value that we see that they lose common ground. And so all you would need to say in your essay is that while they agree on levels of fact and definition because of XYZ, they lose common ground or they become estranged, they disagree on the level of value. And then talk about, okay, what does this reveal about the values for each stakeholder? So for your essay, what it's going to look like is you're going to have your 3 sources with MLA citation. You're going to have stakeholder paragraph number 1, where you talk about how those 3 sources are synthesized to give a good picture of what stakeholder 1 thinks. You're going to have your second 3 sources in MLA format. And then you're going to talk about stakeholder number 2. And then lastly, you're going to have your paragraph that uses stasis to show where these 2 hold or lose common ground. So stakeholder number 1 and stakeholder number 2 hold or lose stasis. Oh, pardon. So some important things that will be good to include in your stakeholder paragraphs is who is the stakeholder? Who are they? What's their relationship to the issue? And what values does this reveal? And then you can do the same thing for stakeholder 2. Who are they? Relationship and values. If you are feeling confused, that is absolutely okay. Stasis theory is the hardest concept we talk about in this course, but it's fundamental to showing how do we listen? How do we get the tenor of the argument so that we can then engage the argument in a meaningful and constructive way? If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.